The late afternoon sun bore down relentlessly on the suburban streets of Phoenix, turning the asphalt into a shimmering ribbon of heat. David Caldwell's sedan moved steadily through the neighborhood, the hum of the engine a quiet counterpoint to the stillness around him. After a demanding day at work, he was looking forward to unwinding with a good book in the cool comfort of his home. As he approached a stop sign, he pressed the brake, coming to a deliberate pause before easing forward. The streets were nearly empty, and the short drive home felt uneventful, until the sudden flash of red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. David frowned slightly but maintained his composure, signaling and pulling over to the curb. He replayed his last few moments on the road. No speeding, no sharp turns. The only thing that came to mind was the stop sign. Had he paused long enough? Possibly not. The patrol car rolled to a stop behind him, its lights still flashing. David let out a slow breath. This wasn't unfamiliar territory, and he had learned long ago how to navigate these situations. He turned off the engine, rolled down his window, and placed his hands firmly on the steering wheel, making sure they were clearly visible. Through his side mirror, he saw the officer emerge from the cruiser. The man moved with a deliberate stride, his sunglasses gleaming in the harsh light. His hand rested on his belt, and his expression was neutral but unreadable. The officer's name tag identified him as Morgan. Morgan stopped beside the car, his posture radiating authority. "License and registration," he said curtly, his tone flat but sharp enough to carry an edge. David nodded, keeping his movements deliberate. "Of course, officer," he replied calmly. He reached into the glove compartment for his documents, pulled them out and handed them over. Morgan took the papers, his eyes briefly scanning the license before flicking up to study David. His gaze lingered a moment too long, moving over David's face, then to the neatly tailored suit he wore. Something shifted in the officer's demeanor, subtle but perceptible. A faint tightness in his jaw, a narrowing of his eyes. "You know why I stopped you?" Morgan asked, his tone carrying more weight now, as if the answer were already incriminating. David met his gaze evenly. "Not entirely, officer," he said. "Was I speeding?" "No," Morgan replied, shaking his head. "You rolled through that stop sign back there." David nodded slightly. "I see," he said. "I didn't think I had. But I understand." Morgan smirked faintly, though it lacked any real humor. "You in a hurry or something?" "No, sir," David answered. "Just heading home." The response seemed to land wrong with Morgan. He shifted his weight, squaring his shoulders as his eyes bore into David. It wasn't the words that had set him off. It was David's tone. Calm, measured, confident. Morgan's expression hardened, and the air between them grew noticeably heavier. "Where's home?" the officer asked suddenly, his tone sharpened by an edge of suspicion. David hesitated briefly, not out of uncertainty, but from the unnecessary nature of the question. "Not far," he said. "The address is on my license." Morgan didn't bother glancing at the license in his hand. Instead, he studied David more intently, his stance stiffening. "You work around here?" he asked. "Yes," David replied evenly. "Downtown. What do you do?" It was a pointed question, and David could tell it wasn't out of curiosity. The officer was testing him, trying to unbalance him. David refused to take the bait. "I'm in federal law enforcement," he said simply. Morgan's reaction was subtle, but it was there. A slight lift of the eyebrows, a tightening of the lips. He held the silence between them for a moment too long, as if recalibrating. "Step out of the car for me," Morgan said abruptly, breaking the stillness. David blinked, caught off guard by the sudden escalation. "Excuse me," he asked, keeping his voice calm but firm. "I said step out of the car," Morgan repeated, his tone colder now. His hand hovered near his holster. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." The air grew taut, the situation teetering on the edge of something more serious. David exhaled slowly, his movements deliberate as he reached for the door handle. This wasn't about the stop sign anymore, and they both knew it. David stepped out of the car slowly, his movements calm and deliberate despite the tension that charged the air. The heat from the asphalt rose in shimmering waves as he stood upright, his suit jacket catching the faint breeze. He turned to face Officer Morgan, his hands naturally at his sides, his expression controlled but unreadable. "Hands on the hood," Morgan ordered brusquely, gesturing toward the front of the car. His hand lingered near his holster, a subtle but unmistakable display of authority. David hesitated briefly, his gaze meeting Morgan's with a steady calm. He wasn't intimidated, but he also knew the weight of the moment. Compliance was the surest way to prevent an already tense situation from spiraling. Wordlessly, he moved to the front of the car, placing his palms flat on the hood. The metal was hot under his skin, radiating the afternoon's relentless heat. Behind him, Morgan approached with deliberate steps. David could hear the faint rustle of the officer's uniform and the clinking of his utility belt. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the silence of the street. "Spread your legs," Morgan barked, his voice cutting through the quiet. David complied without protest, widening his stance as Morgan moved closer. He felt the officer's hands on his shoulders first, firm, rough, and unrelenting as they pressed down and moved across his body. The search was invasive, more forceful than necessary, and David couldn't help but feel the deliberate intention behind it. Morgan's hands patted his sides, brushed over his pockets, and lingered too long at his waistband. David held his tongue, his breathing steady as he stared straight ahead. The search continued, Morgan pulling at the pockets of David's tailored slacks and patting down the folds of his jacket. The officer's movements were sharp and aggressive, as though he were searching for something specific, something incriminating. "You carrying any weapons?" Morgan asked, his tone laced with suspicion. "No, officer," David replied, his voice even. "Anything sharp? Drugs? Contraband?" Morgan pressed, his hands moving to David's ankles and shoes. "No, officer," David repeated. The officer straightened, stepping back slightly but keeping his gaze fixed on David. "You seem awfully calm for someone getting searched," he said, his tone almost accusatory. "Most people would be nervous by now." David turned his head slightly, glancing over his shoulder. "I'm not most people," he said simply, his voice neutral. Morgan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he folded his arms across his chest, his posture rigid. The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. David could feel the weight of Morgan's scrutiny, the way the officer's gaze lingered as though trying to find something, anything, that would justify his actions. "All right," Morgan said finally, his tone grudging. "Turn around." David complied, pivoting to face the officer. He adjusted his suit jacket slightly, brushing away the wrinkles caused by Morgan's rough handling. His expression remained calm, but there was a subtle sharpness in his eyes now, a glint of something that Morgan couldn't quite place. "Now," Morgan began, his voice firm, "you're gonna explain what you're doing around here dressed like that. You don't exactly look like you're from this neighborhood." David raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly does someone from this neighborhood look like, officer?" he asked, his tone measured but pointed. Morgan bristled, his posture stiffening. "Don't play games with me," he snapped. "You know what I mean." David let the words hang in the air for a moment, his gaze steady. Then, with a deliberate slowness, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. "I'm going to show you something," he said calmly, his movements deliberate. "Don't worry. It's not a weapon." Morgan's hand instinctively dropped to his holster, his fingers brushing the grip of his sidearm. "What are you reaching for?" he demanded, his voice sharp. David paused, his hand still inside his jacket. "My badge," he said evenly. "I'm a federal agent. I'd like you to see my credentials." Morgan's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he watched David carefully. "Go ahead," he said finally, his tone begrudging. David withdrew a slim leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing a gleaming gold badge and identification card. He held it up for Morgan to see, his expression calm but resolute. "David Caldwell," he said, his voice steady. "Senior Special Agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, stationed here in Phoenix." Morgan's reaction was immediate. His face paled, and his posture faltered, the confidence he'd worn like armor slipping away. His mouth opened slightly as though to speak, but no words came out. For a moment, he simply stared at the badge, his hand falling away from his holster. "You're FBI?" Morgan finally managed, his voice cracking slightly. "Yes," David replied, closing the wallet and tucking it back into his jacket. "And I'd like to talk to you about the way this interaction has unfolded." Morgan's brows furrowed, confusion and unease flickering across his face. Look, Agent Caldwell, I didn't know that I was FBI?" David finished, his tone sharp. "No, you didn't. And that's the problem, isn't it? You didn't know who I was. But you made a lot of assumptions anyway." Morgan blinked, clearly at a loss for words. David took a step closer, his voice calm but firm as he continued. "Let me tell you what just happened," David said. "You pulled me over for allegedly rolling through a stop sign. A minor infraction at best. But the moment you saw me, a black man in a suit, your approach changed. You escalated this interaction without cause. You searched me, questioned me, and treated me with suspicion. All because I didn't fit whatever narrative you'd already constructed in your mind." Morgan opened his mouth to protest, but David cut him off. "Save it," David said, his voice rising slightly. "This isn't just about me. This is about every person you've treated this way. Every person who didn't have a badge to pull out, who didn't have the privilege or the power to challenge you." Morgan's face reddened, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "I was just doing my job," he muttered weakly. "Were you?" David asked, his voice sharp. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you were profiling. And if you think that's your job, then we have a much bigger problem on our hands." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Morgan didn't seem to know how to respond. His confidence had crumbled, replaced by an awkward defensiveness that only underscored David's point. "This isn't about one officer or one stop," David said, his tone softening slightly but losing none of its intensity. "This is about a system that enables and perpetuates this kind of behavior. You're not just acting on your own biases, Officer Morgan. You're part of a culture that allows those biases to thrive." Morgan looked down, avoiding David's gaze. For the first time, he seemed genuinely shaken, his bravado replaced by uncertainty. David took a step back, giving the officer room to breathe. "I'll be filing a report about this incident," he said calmly. "Not just about your behavior, but about the broader issues it reflects. And I'm going to make sure this conversation doesn't end here." Morgan nodded stiffly, his eyes still downcast. He muttered something unintelligible, but David didn't press him. The message had been delivered. As David walked back to his car, the heat of the moment lingered, mingling with the Arizona sun. David sat at his desk in the FBI field office, the Arizona sun casting long shadows across the stacks of case files and reports. The quiet hum of the air conditioning was a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. The interaction with Officer Morgan played over and over in his head, not because it was unique, but because it wasn't. That, David realized, was the heart of the problem. He logged into the Bureau's internal system, pulling up the reporting portal. Filing a formal complaint wasn't an impulsive decision. It was a deliberate one. He knew the weight of the step he was about to take. In law enforcement, loyalty often blurred lines between right and wrong, and speaking out against an officer, even one outside the Bureau, would ripple through the system. But silence, David knew, would be complicit. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before he began typing. The report was thorough, detailing every aspect of the interaction, from Morgan's tone and demeanor to the unnecessary escalation and invasive search. David didn't omit a single detail, even including his own thoughts about the implicit bias that seemed to underpin the entire encounter. Once the report was submitted, David leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. It wasn't just about Morgan. It was about a system that enabled officers like him to act with impunity. The next step was clear. He needed to dig deeper. David's search into Morgan's record began with the department's publicly available data, commendations, awards, and basic service history. Morgan, it seemed, had been with the Phoenix Police Department for over a decade. His record showed the typical accolades of a seasoned officer: citations for bravery, letters of recognition for community service, and a commendation for handling a tense domestic violence situation. But the deeper David looked, the murkier things became. Using the Bureau's access to interagency reports and databases, he found buried complaints, allegations of racial bias, unnecessary use of force, and conduct unbecoming. None of them had resulted in serious disciplinary action. Most were marked as unsubstantiated or dismissed after internal review. A few had been quietly resolved with sensitivity training or a written reprimand, leaving Morgan free to continue his career. One complaint stood out. A young black man had reported Morgan for an incident eerily similar to David's own experience. The man claimed he'd been pulled over for a minor traffic violation, only to be treated aggressively and searched without cause. He'd filed a formal grievance, but it had gone nowhere. The department cited insufficient evidence and officer discretion as reasons for dismissing the case. David frowned, his chest tightening as he read the case notes. Patterns like these weren't just coincidental, they were systemic. Morgan wasn't an anomaly, he was a symptom. The following morning, David sat across from FBI Assistant Special Agent in Charge Vanessa Haywood, briefing her on the incident and his findings. Haywood, a no-nonsense leader with a reputation for fairness, listened intently, her sharp eyes never leaving his as he laid out the details. "I'm not here to settle a personal grudge," David said, leaning forward. "This is about more than one officer. The number of complaints against Morgan, and the department's consistent dismissal of them, points to a larger issue. We can't ignore this." Haywood nodded slowly. "You're suggesting an interagency review?" "I am," David said firmly. "We need to work with Phoenix PD to address this at a systemic level. Anti-bias training, accountability measures, and overhaul of how complaints are handled. It all needs to be on the table." Haywood leaned back, folding her arms. "You realize how this will be received, right? Police departments don't exactly love the idea of federal oversight." "I know," David replied, "but we can't let that stop us. This isn't about stepping on toes. It's about restoring trust. If we're serious about justice, we have to be willing to address the flaws in our own house." After a long moment of consideration, Haywood nodded. "All right, draft a proposal. I'll set up a meeting with Chief Reynolds." The meeting with Phoenix Police Chief Reynolds took place in a sterile conference room at police headquarters. The tension was palpable as David, Haywood, and a small team of FBI representatives sat across from Reynolds and his senior staff. Reynolds, a grizzled veteran of the force with decades of service under his belt, looked skeptical as David outlined the proposal. "Let me get this straight," Reynolds said, his tone cautious. "You want us to open our department to federal review, overhaul our training, and implement new protocols, all because of one traffic stop?" "With respect, Chief," David said, his voice steady, "this isn't about one stop. It's about the pattern of behavior that stop reflects. Officer Morgan's actions weren't isolated. They're part of a broader issue that affects your department's relationship with the community." Reynolds's jaw tightened. "We already have accountability measures in place. And yet Morgan's history shows repeated complaints of bias and misconduct," David countered. "Complaints that were dismissed or minimized. The current measures aren't enough." The room fell silent for a moment. David leaned forward, his tone softening but losing none of its conviction. "Chief, this isn't an attack on your department. It's an opportunity. By addressing these issues head-on, you can rebuild trust with the community and set an example for departments across the country." Reynolds sighed heavily, rubbing the back of his neck. "This is going to ruffle a lot of feathers." "Good," David said simply. "That's how change starts." After a long pause, Reynolds nodded reluctantly. "Fine, let's do it." As the review began, Officer Morgan was placed on unpaid suspension pending a disciplinary hearing. David didn't attend the hearing, but he received updates through official channels. Morgan was combative at first, dismissing the complaints as misunderstandings and blaming anti-police bias for the scrutiny. But as evidence mounted, David's report, the other complaints, and internal records, it became clear that Morgan's behavior wasn't defensible. The hearing concluded with a suspension, a requirement for additional training, and a warning that further incidents would result in termination. But for David, the hearing wasn't the victory. It was a symptom of the real problem, a culture that allowed officers like Morgan to thrive unchecked for years. David's focus shifted to the broader initiative. The review process was painstaking, involving interviews with officers, community leaders, and residents who had lodged complaints. David worked closely with both FBI analysts and Phoenix PD's internal affairs team, drafting recommendations for new protocols, mandatory anti-bias training, an independent review board for complaints, and clearer accountability measures. Community forums became a cornerstone of the initiative. David attended each one, listening as residents shared stories of mistreatment, distrust, and fear. Their voices were raw and powerful, a reminder of what was at stake. At one forum, a young black woman stood up, her voice trembling with emotion as she described her own encounter with Morgan. "He treated me like a criminal for a broken taillight," she said. "It wasn't just him. It's the whole system that lets people like him keep doing this." David nodded, his heart heavy but resolute. "That's why we're here," he said. "To fix the system, not just the symptoms." By the time the review concluded, the department had begun implementing several of the recommended changes. Progress was slow, but it was progress. David knew there was still a long way to go, but for the first time, there was momentum. The auditorium buzzed with energy, a quiet hum of voices mingling with the occasional scrape of a chair. It was a community space, its walls lined with faded murals depicting moments of solidarity and resilience. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the room, filling quickly as residents, law enforcement officers, and community leaders gathered for a public forum. At the center stood David Caldwell, his calm demeanor commanding attention as he adjusted the microphone. This was the first of many discussions David had planned. He knew that restoring trust required more than policy changes. It demanded conversations, open, honest, and often uncomfortable ones. Trust wasn't something that could be mandated. It had to be built piece by piece through understanding and accountability. As the murmurs settled into silence, David began. "Good evening," he said, his voice steady but warm. "Thank you all for being here tonight. Your presence speaks to a shared commitment to this community, to making it better for everyone." He let his words settle, scanning the crowd. He recognized some of the faces. Officers from the Phoenix Police Department who had reluctantly agreed to participate, community activists who had long demanded justice, and residents who carried stories of mistrust and frustration. Their expressions ranged from hopeful to skeptical, but they were all listening. David continued, "Tonight isn't about blame. It's about understanding. It's about recognizing that the relationship between law enforcement and the community it serves is broken, and that repairing it requires all of us." He paused, meeting the eyes of a young black man in the front row. The man nodded slightly, his arms crossed but his gaze intent. David took that as a signal to press forward. The forums were structured as open dialogues, where community members could share their experiences and officers could listen, truly listen, without defensiveness. David moderated carefully, ensuring that every voice was heard and every perspective respected. The stories that emerged were raw and powerful. A mother recounted the fear she felt every time her teenage son left the house, knowing how easily he could be mistaken for a threat. An officer shared the emotional toll of patrolling neighborhoods where he was seen not as a protector, but as an oppressor. A local pastor spoke of the need for grace on both sides, for patience and forgiveness even in the face of deep wounds. David guided the conversation with a steady hand. "Change starts with acknowledging the truth," he said during one session. "The truth that bias exists, the truth that power can be abused, and the truth that accountability is not an attack. It's a foundation for trust." The officers in attendance didn't always respond warmly. Some bristled at the accusations of systemic failure, while others sat quietly, their faces etched with discomfort. But as the sessions continued, something shifted. Officers began asking questions, seeking solutions instead of deflecting blame. Community members, seeing genuine effort, started to soften their tone, moving from anger to collaboration. The turning point came during a town hall held at City Hall, a larger venue packed to capacity. The atmosphere was electric, charged with both tension and anticipation. David stood at the podium, his FBI badge tucked away in his pocket. Tonight, he wasn't just a federal agent, he was a bridge between two worlds. "This isn't about choosing sides," David began, his voice strong but measured. "It's about recognizing that we are all part of the same community. Law enforcement officers have a duty to protect and serve, and that duty must be carried out with honesty, fairness, and respect." He glanced toward the rows of uniformed officers seated near the front. "When you put on that badge, you take on a responsibility that is both profound and heavy. You're not just enforcing laws, you're shaping the way people see justice. Every interaction, every decision, every word carries weight. Never forget that." The audience was silent, hanging on his every word. David shifted his gaze to the community members scattered throughout the room. "And for those of you who feel betrayed by the system, I hear you. Your trust has been broken, and that pain is real. But we can't build walls of anger and expect them to protect us. We have to dismantle those walls and rebuild something stronger, a foundation of accountability and transparency." David outlined his vision for reform, emphasizing tangible steps. Independent review boards for complaints, mandatory anti-bias training, and community policing initiatives that foster relationships rather than fear. His words were practical, but they carried an emotional weight that resonated with everyone in the room. "We cannot treat reform as a check-the-box exercise," he said. "This is about culture, about how we see one another and how we see ourselves. It's about creating a system where fairness isn't an aspiration. It's the standard." As David concluded his remarks, he stepped away from the podium and invited the audience to share their thoughts. The discussions that followed were intense but productive. Officers expressed their frustrations with being painted as villains, while residents shared the exhaustion of constantly having to prove their humanity. It wasn't easy, but it was real, and that was the point. By the end of the night, the room felt different. It wasn't healed. It would take years, maybe decades, to fully mend the rift. But there was a glimmer of something new: understanding. The impact of David's efforts rippled through the city. More forums were held, bringing in voices from every corner of the community. Workshops on de-escalation and cultural competency became standard for the police department. An independent oversight board was established, its members drawn from diverse backgrounds to ensure accountability. David, though, remained grounded. He knew that change wasn't a moment. It was a process. He continued to show up, to listen, and to push for reforms that addressed the root causes of distrust. His work wasn't about personal recognition. It was about paving the way for a future where trust wasn't the exception but the rule. Months later, at a smaller community event, a young boy approached David. "Are you the man who talks to the police?" he asked, his voice shy but curious. David smiled. "I try," he said, "but it's not just me. It's all of us." The boy nodded thoughtfully before asking, "Do you think things will get better?" David crouched to the boy's level, his expression earnest. "I do," he said, "but only if we keep working for it. Together." As the boy's mother called him back, David stood, watching them walk away. The moment was small, but it carried the weight of everything he'd been working toward. Progress wasn't perfect, and the road ahead was long, but it was a road worth traveling. And for the first time in a long while, David felt hope, not just for himself but for everyone.